Crichton's strange gait carried him up the steps of the Forum of Justice and through the snarling knot of Guelph protesters who jabbed their placards up and down in the stifling evening heat. Seeing a mechanoid apologising his way through the crowd, the mob immediately presumed Crichton was a member of the Justice Department, and a monsoon of spittle and bad food poured down on him. As ever, Crichton was kind and courteous. He wished the baying mob good day, and remarked on how absolutely splendid their placards looked, and indeed, how well and how far they could spit. A shiver of admiration shot through his whole being. Crichton loved anyone who bucked the system, because it was a characteristic totally absent from his own programming. He entered the low flat building, handed over his letter of appointment, and was escorted down a series of corridors. The regulator sat behind a marble desk, perusing a handwritten scroll. Crichton bowed deeply. "My lord, it is a most extraordinary honour for a life form as humble and lowly and worthless as myself, a mere mechanoid 4000 sanitation droid, to be allowed to meet you in your own chamber and partake of the very same oxygen molecules as your esteemedness." The regulator peered at him through half-open eyes. "Yes, I suppose it is." "I'm searching for a human who calls himself Lister. I understand he passed through your courtroom." The regulator nodded. "I have been unable to discern the exact nature of his offences against the glorious Guelph state, and I wonder, my lord, if you might tell me." "His crime is a serious one. He destroyed the asteroid of Sirius 3, and looted and plundered his way across the entire belt. He destroyed a starhopper, which served Ariel 2, and he was responsible for many deaths, including my own." "He killed you, my lord?" "I'm afraid he did." "I'm not sure I understand, sir." "Does anyone? What possesses a creature to go on such a wicked orgy of murder and mayhem?" "No, sir. I mean, I don't understand how he killed you, and yet you are patently still alive, talking to me." "He hasn't killed me yet, you imbecile droid. He hasn't committed any crime yet. It's something he's destined to do in the future." "So, at this precise moment, he is innocent?" "Well, of course he's innocent at the moment. He hasn't committed his crime yet." "Wouldn't it be fairer to—" "What? You mean wait until he's actually committed the crime before we punish him?" "Well, it's a slightly radical thought, I realise, but perhaps it's a more—" Crichton's voice trailed away into silence. Then he looked up and said, "I'm just being ridiculous, aren't I?" "If you wait until the crime has been committed before you punish the guilty, then the crime has been permitted to happen. And what kind of absurd system of justice is that?" "An absurd one indeed," Crichton found himself saying. "So how do we know Lister will commit these crimes?" "There is much evidence." "There is?" "Oh, yes." The regulator beckoned Crichton forward, and then said softly, "The mystics have seen it. They saw it in their dreams. They saw it in the great fire that celebrates the dawn of a new cycle. And they saw it in the oils of Cyfedydd. All 6 of them." "And they're certain it was Lister they saw?" "They haven't seen a crime this clearly since they ordered the execution of the Guelph known as Srigandum for doing revolting things to a yak in 3 cycles' time." Crichton smiled warmly. "Oh, one last thing. Where is he serving his sentence?" "He is a prisoner in the penal colony known as Siberia, on Latomi 5. "Is he permitted visitors?" "Not until he's completed 5 years of his sentence." Crichton excused himself and left. He knew now what the Guelphs outside were protesting about. They wanted an end to the mystic system of justice, where anyone could be thrown into Siberia with no hope of defence. Crichton walked down the steps of the Forum of Justice. In a way, he was pleased. A tiny lacuna of doubt had tormented him since they had first come across the alternate starbug. At the time, he'd wondered if Lister had killed the crew himself. Now he knew the truth.
The alarm clanged into life, and Lister emerged from under sheets that looked and smelt as if they'd been used by mating hippos, and started to grope around to silence the banshee wail that sliced through his head like a laser knife. He jacked open one eye and started to search for the off button. He turned the clock round and round, all the time its grotesque buzz burrowing through his eyes. It made his toothache worse, and the boil on the inside of his left nostril throbbed more than ever. After what seemed an eternity, longer even than the time it used to take to get served in an electrical store on a Saturday afternoon, he arrived at the conclusion there was no off button. He hurled the clock to the floor and smashed it to death with the heel of his shoe. Or thought he had. But no. Just as he was climbing back into bed, the clock lurched back into life. He decided the only solution was to evacuate the room. He closed the door behind him and found himself in the kitchen. The smell of dead gravy sodomized both his nostrils. Leaning towers of dirty washing were piled on every available worktop. He skated his way across the fat-splashed floor and opened the fridge. Green milk pussed out of the top of bottles, and something that looked dangerously close to an orangutan fetus was in a bowl covered in cling film. Well, he thought, I've lived in worse places than this. In fact, the fridge and kitchen are pretty tidy. He looked down at the welcome hamper on the table and picked up the letter which had been placed on the top. Dear Mr. Lister, welcome to hell. Once you've settled in, we hope your stay with us here will be an excruciating nightmare of torment and revulsion. If for any reason you discover anything is comfortable or pleasant, or in any way to your liking, please do not hesitate to call us, and one of our staff will be very happy to ensure that everything is extremely unpleasant again as soon as possible. Yours, as ever, the Siberian Management. Lister peered in at the hamper's contents: sprout broth, sprout pate, sprout wine, 4 packs of herbal cigarettes, a carton of dog's milk, and a book called Hamilton Academicals, The Glory Years. Suddenly, from the apartment above, the strains of a Neil Diamond song vibrated the dead light bulb, while from the apartment next door, the bass thump of a demented drum solo began to pound into his skull. He had to get out of here. But did he have any clothes? An old, dilapidated wardrobe stood somberly in one corner of the room. He knew what was in it before he even opened its horrifying, eye-piercing squeak of a door. 5 traffic-light-coloured striped tank tops hung neatly on a row of hangers. 2 pairs of orange dungarees hung on 2 more hangers, and alongside them 3 shirts, painted with newly cut hair. Underneath were 3 pairs of shoes that Lister guessed correctly were half a size too small. He dressed in his ridiculous itching clothes and decided to take a stroll around town, to take a look at hell from the outside. The herd of short-haired yaks gazed up into the night sky and paid no attention whatsoever as the small green ship dropped its landing legs and prepared to touch down. Suddenly, there was something else for the yaks not to be impressed about, as a panic of black-cowled figures hurried out of the half-moon of tents that were grouped around the watering hole and rushed past them, loading automatic rifles and unsheathing scimitars. The small green ship landed on the crest of a surf of sand in the baking desert heat, and 5 figures stood in the open hatchway, wearing fur-lined anoraks, ski goggles, and snowshoes. "Sorry, guys," said Lister. "My fault. Didn't think ahead. I should have checked the weather computer." "You never think ahead, you mookel," said Kachansky, without rancour. "You're allergic to planning." They retreated back inside the craft and emerged some minutes later in beachwear. Lister addressed the horseshoe figures. "Are you guys Kinatawawi? Nomads? Badawi?" Silence. We have a friend in Siberia. We need help. Weapons, information, soldiers. Silence. We have much we can trade. Look, Levi jeans, whiskey, VCRs. Spam. We need help to rescue our comrade. Comprende? Crichton translated. The Kinatawawi nodded and started back towards their encampment. Rimmer stared after them. According to some rogue droid they'd met in a bar back on Blerius 15, Kinatawawis were supposed to be friendly-ish. They travelled in tribes, roaming the plains of the desert asteroids, and bartered with the various Gelf communities for emotions and memories which they sold on to simulants for vast profit. Rimmer didn't trust them. In fact, he found it almost impossible to trust anyone, a characteristic which gave his face its fleshless lips and added sharp points to his nose and chin. His smile was like an iceberg. 2/3 of it remained under the surface. Suggest 2 of us stay back in case anything goes awry. Take Crichton, he's expendable.
I'm on my way, sir.
The mechanoid beamed happily and made to walk down the disembarkation steps. Lister stopped him with a look. If anyone stays back, it should be Chris. These dudes are supposed to be pretty weird around attractive women. Miss Kachansky, ma'am, Rimmer saluted smartly. Wish to volunteer to be your assistant, ma'am, on your extremely dangerous mission to stay behind and look after Starbug, ma'am. No need. I'll be fine, Mr. Rimmer. Rimmer gave her one of his icebergs. A tent-flap was flung back, and the leader of the Kinatawawi strode towards them. Here, He
says, do we want to trade, sir? Crichton translated.
Tell him we need aid to get our friend out of Siberia. We understand for the right price he can help us. Crichton translated, and the chief spoke quickly in Kinatawawese.
Sir, he says it is true they can help, but the price will be steep.
Tell him we're loaded. The cat's laugh roared around the encampment. The rogue droids lay on their backs in rows of 10s. In all, there must have been close to 1,000. It was like a cross between an android burial ground and a car dump. Most of them were injured, one-eyed, one-armed, legless, or with holes in their stomachs showing daylight. Azenji!
He's saying choose, sir.
But they're all dead, said the cat. What the hell is there to choose? The Kinatawawi chief held out a box of microboards and shook it.
He says they're disarmed. Once the microboards are restored to their CPUs, they'll be fully functional.
Can we trust him? Is he the sort of guy you can buy a second-hand droid off? Crichton turned and peered at the chief as he leaned on one foot, beating his hands together shiftily.
Probably not. However, if we want to get your other self out of Siberia, we need help.
Lister nodded. We want to see some of them working. Hickmee!
He wants to know which one, sir.
Lister stepped into the matrix of droids and started to make his choices. The 12 droids stood to a sloppy attention as Lister walked down the line to inspect them. The first 3 were in moderate condition, all limbs present and correct. After that, the platoon went downhill. Fast. Rogue droids 4 and 5 had missing left arms, 6 and 7 had ears and left legs missing, and moved by using their arms, like 3-legged dogs. 8's eyes hung down his chest on their sensor wires. 9 was complete, but had a tendency to giggle and blow saliva bubbles. 10 had no upper body whatsoever, being basically just a pair of legs. 11's head was absent without leave, and 12 was just a hand. Attention, Lister barked. By the left, quick march, left, right, left, right, left, right. The platoon slumped, slouched, limped, hopped, crawled and shuffled up and down the desert dune as Lister put them through their paces. The Kinatawawi chief led them into the tent piled high with ammunition and computers. Already seated around the fire were 4 other Kinatawawis. They stood, bowed, then reseated themselves. 2 females, 2 males. The chief flipped open a metal crate and took out a screw-top vacuum-sealed flask and emptied something into the palm of his hand. It was a tiny pink disc. "What is it?" asked the cat.
"A computer virus," said Crichton.
"Fit ye off, get Nick be killed."
Crichton nodded. "He says it's more powerful than the sun.
Get
It kills electricity." Extraordinary. He says with the powers of the disk, we will be able to bring down the entire cyber system.
"Show us," said Lister, gesturing with his hands. The chief dragged 2 computers from the pile of dead machinery and connected them together.
"He's inviting you to modem the virus from one machine to the next."
The cat pressed the keypad and watched the second computer explode in a plume of blue flame. The laughter and smiles swirled around the tent.
Now he says he will insert the antidote disk.
The chief inserted the blue disk into the second computer, and it pinged jauntily back to life. Lister led the applause. "OK, we'll take the virus and the antidote and the dirty dozen out there. Say half a test tube." Lister rolled up his trouser leg and took out a single cigar tin that was tied around his ankle. He handed the test tube to the chief. The chief rolled it around in his hand, then pulled out the cork and smelled it.
He says, "What is this?"
What does he think it is? "Jiggy ginger."
He says it smells like sperm.
"Tell him it's mine," said Lister proudly. "I can vouch for it."
"Hi, Bijiji," Crichton replied.
"Need face ginger."
He says, "And you're giving it to me?"
"You bet," Lister twinkled.
"Sir, I—" He says this is an outrage.
"He wants more," said Lister, unrolling his left trouser leg. "Well, I'll give him more." "That's mine," said the cat, pointing at himself. Lister turned to Crichton. "Is there a problem?" "Listy, mon frere," said Rimmer, wearing a grin the size of a billboard. "Methinks the Kinnatawawis aren't sterile and don't have a spermatozoan-based monetary system, and if that's the case, imagine how it looks. Because to his eyes you've just given him a tube of your love custard, then looked mighty peeved when he wasn't thrilled to receive it."
What's he saying now? He's saying to make up for this insult, you must prove that you have respect for him and for his people.
"Tell him I do respect him and his people."
He says you must prove it.
Anything except hand-to-hand combat with their strongest warrior wearing just skimpy leather thongs. The chief spat and jabbed his finger in the air and pointed at the group of Kinnatawawi sitting around the fire.
"Sir, he says you must marry his daughter."
The chief strode across the tent and gestured at the figure sitting in the middle of the group. She was 6'6", and covered in matted brown fur, with a black hippo nose and encrusted saliva around her mouth. "That's his daughter."
"One of 3, sir. Apparently, she's the looker."
"Hey, wait, what about Chris? I'm taken." Rimmer's nostrils flared open. "Come on, Listy. You've dated worse. Only due to very poor disco lighting."
He's saying no wedding, no deal.
The Kinnatawawis rose, barked abuse and departed. Lister suddenly became aware that 3 pairs of eyes were staring at him. "I am not going down to Mospros for anyone who's less attractive than my own armpit after 20 games of table tennis." Rimmer was incredulous. "Are you going to blow the whole deal just because she doesn't hit your G-spot? Rimmer, believe me, it would never work out. I'm a Pisces, and she's part smegging hippopotamus. That, to my mind, makes us incompatible."
"Sir, they're a proud people. They won't change their minds. The only possible way we are ever going to get our hands on the virus and the rogue droids is if you agree to marry Kakak.
That's her name."
Crichton nodded.
"Man, I could never settle down with someone whose name sounds like a footballer clearing his nose. Look, Listy, the plan is as plain as a Bulgarian pin-up. We do the trade, you go through with the wedding, and when everyone's asleep, we come back and rescue you. Look, no way. Forget it. Lister stood in his Kinatawawi's wedding gown, a garland of flowers on his head, as the priest conducted the service. Crichton leaned in and spoke in a confidential tone.
Sir, you have to say, Kan gi chi na toka han na wok hagi, which means you will love until a time when there is no sand in the desert and the sun is as cold as a yak's nipple on a winter's night. Kan ki ji, Crichton prompted.
Kan ki ji.
Na toka,
said Lister.
han na
Wok agi. Halachlaket, said the priest. Now what's he saying?
He's saying you may kiss the bride.
What? Without a bag? Everyone is watching, said Rimmer through a mouth borrowed from a bad ventriloquist. Lister adjusted his garter and nodded. Crichton, man, give me a leg up. Crichton linked his two hands together, and Lister hoisted himself up and kissed his bride. She grabbed him gleefully around his tiny waist and bear-hugged the air out of him. Then she tossed him over her shoulder and started to carry him off to their wedding hut. As he hung down her back, a maiden at the mercy of a Viking on the pillage, Lister called to his crewmates. "See you soon, guys. Looking any time now. Don't be strangers." The chief nodded and handed the mechanoid the vacuum flask containing the two viruses, and some astro strippers Crichton had taken a shine to. When there was time, he intended to repaint the ship.
Suggest we get the rogue droids aboard Starbug and leave at first light, sirs.
Rimmer and Cat nodded. The door of the wedding hut creaked open, and Lister's bride unceremoniously dumped him on the pile of yak skin cushions that made up their wedding bed. "Heg on a knick-knackin'," said his bride, and started to take off her wedding gown. "Well, what a day, darling. Boy, am I pooped. Straight to sleep for me." Her gown dropped onto the straw matting, and she started to clamber out of her sexy honeymoon pantaloons. They could have sailed a 40-foot schooner across the Atlantic and back. Lister pulled the blanket up around his chin and yawned nervously. It was hard not to notice that her bikini line would probably have defeated all but the most powerful petrol-powered hedge trimmer. You've been looking forward to this, haven't you? You're not going to take no for an answer. Knack-a-knack-nick. How about a drink first? Lister mimed drinking. Hack, nodded, and pointed to a clay jug with two goblets on a tray by the side of their bed. Lister filled her goblet up to the brim and took a small amount himself, and then proposed a toast. "To unconsummated wedding nights." "Jiggy, she replied, and they started to drink. Lister took a tiny medicine-sized sip of the stuff and watched her devour hers and pour herself another. He remembered thinking everything was going to plan, when suddenly he grimaced, his stomach felt as if there was a skipping pig inside it, a quite common reaction to those unaccustomed to Kinatawawi moonshine. Then he poleaxed backwards onto his wedding bed. He couldn't remember what it was called. There was a name for it. It was very popular. What the hell was it called? He dropped into unconsciousness again. Then that feeling again. If only he could remember what he was doing. Everything would make sense. It was something he shouldn't forget. Concentrate. He would get it this time. What was he doing? It was something he hadn't done a lot of recently. He was having sex. That's what he was doing. He was having sex. But who with? He opened his eyes and saw her naked silhouette riding on top of him. Wait a minute. Sex? He was having sex? With a grizzly bear? Nah, of course he wasn't. Crazy idea. It must be Chris wearing an old gorillagram costume. Why would she be doing that? Had she ever done anything like that before? No. So why now? Damn his eyes. He tried to rub them back into focus, but her mighty hands pulled them away from his face and placed them back on her large, hairy breasts. Hairy breasts? Wait a minute. His scream exploded into the cold night air. She placed a rough paw over his mouth and rode him even faster. Oh my God, he was close to climax. Oh, he was so disgusted. Did he have no self-control? She was descended from hippos, for God's sake. Oh, help! Help! The two elders sat in front of the open fire, frying celebratory katangu nuts to bless the wedding of Peterfagun's daughter, when the naked figure of the human man dived out of the tent and started to run through the encampment towards the small green transport craft. He opened his mouth and hollered as he moved. "Change of plan! Leg it!" The voice of the Siberian flight controller repeated its request for the craft's ident number and landing authorization code. For the third time in as many minutes, the cat ignored it. The voice was unrelenting. "Kindly state craft ident number and landing authorization code." Crichton's eyes swept the scanner. Didn't make sense. The Ptolemy 5 was only 500 miles across, and they'd swept the planetoid twice, and still couldn't find Siberia. "State craft ident number, otherwise a fleet of cyberceptors will be launched to engage your craft in combat." "There!" The cat flashed his famous 40-tooth smile and pointed to the scanner as a blinking yellow cross signalled a large power source. The scanners must have missed it through the storm. I'm taking it down." The craft flopped clumsily onto its belly. The engines wound down and the retros whinnied into silence. A hatch opened, and three figures scrambled out. As they trudged their way up the dune, Starbug blared off over their heads in the direction of Siberia. Rimmer pulled down his bush hat and asked himself why he was even here. Why him? He was not cut out for commando raids on enemy installations. He wasn't the macho type. He was someone who had needed a friendly hand to hold whenever he underwent dental surgery, a habit he hadn't kicked until he was 28. He was someone who had a medically authenticated fear of blood. That's why he never became a famous brain surgeon. One tiny droplet of the stuff, and he was on his back, faster than his mother in the presence of a high-ranking officer. What Rimmer was a thinker, a plotter, a commander of men, not a fighter. He was someone who sat on top of the hill in the general's tent, planning the campaign and drinking fine wines. He was too intelligent to be brave. That was why he never suffered the fool's rush of blood to the head that caused one man to fall across a grenade to save another. He was more likely to pick up a man and throw him over the grenade to protect himself. He remembered an old girlfriend, Yvonne Magruder. They'd had a torrid fling back in the old days on Red Dwarf. It hadn't lasted much more than one long, glorious weekend, but Rimmer thought about her still. She'd summed him up pretty well once. She'd said he was a brave man trapped inside the body of a coward. Rimmer liked that definition of himself. "How about this?" Kachansky stopped under a telegraph pole positioned on the arc of a tight left-hand bend. Crichton scanned the desert road. "Excellent." Kachansky shimmied up the pole's climbing rungs, and Crichton started to strip the canvas covers off the computer and attach leads into the serial ports. A real officer would not have shimmied up the pole. A real officer would have delegated. "Rimmer, stop mooning about and get up that pole. You're a bloody maggot. Where are you?" And he would have had to reply, "I'm a bloody maggot, Mom. On my way up the pole, Mom. Thank you, Mom." Then she would have been a real officer, and maybe then she would have got a little of his respect. Suddenly, he was aware that she was talking to him. Rimmer! What?
The leads! Hand up the leads!
Certainly. A trompe-l'oeil smile of affection painted itself across his lips. If I recall my military history correctly, there was a most famous Japanese general called Kamikaze, who made a name for himself by his rather original approach to battle. Comforting to know we're treading in the footsteps of one of the truly great military thinkers. Crichton clicked the computer on, took out the pink disk, then loaded it into the computer's hard drive and waited. After a few seconds, a warning trilled across the screen. You have just loaded the Oblivion virus. It destabilizes the electron-proton relationship of the electric charge as it passes through it. The Oblivion virus kills electricity. Do you have the antidote disk? Crichton pressed Y and waited for the next instruction. Please enter antidote disk. Crichton entered the antidote disk. In 10 minutes, the Oblivion virus would be released into the fibre optics of the telephone wire and would then hurtle on towards Siberia. 5 seconds after that, there would be no electricity on Latomi 5. Just enough time for Lister and the cat to get into position for their drop into Siberia. Suddenly the sand was stirred into a swarm of tornado twisters. The cyberceptors swept over the dune in a diamond formation, underbelly floodlights lighting up the desert. Kachansky hit Crichton at waist height and bundled them into the sand. They lay there for some moments as the crafts passed overhead. Kachansky spat out a mouthful of desert. You think they saw us? The Kinatawawi have set us up, said Rimmer.
The dust storm won't help visibility, sir. I believe there's every good chance they missed us.
There were 5 loud clicks behind them. They turned and stared into the barrels of 5 clip-loading T-27 Electron harpoons. Crichton smiled benignly.
We don't have a craft.
The Guelph captain stepped forward, like the other Siberian guards. It was a Dolo chimp. Kachansky shuddered. It possessed the matte grey, bottle-headed snout of the dolphin, the spindly legs of the locust, and the arms and upper body parts of the chimp. Slowly it took a hollow whip from its belt. The orange lash of light hovered in the air. Craft!
I promise you, sir, we don't...
The lash swished through the desert night and sliced through Crichton's right leg as if it was soft ice cream. Dumbstruck, Crichton watched his leg clang to the ground beside him. Please take us to your craft. Kachansky picked up Crichton's leg and nodded. Crichton sat between Kachansky and Rimmer, clutching his lasered leg. He doubted it was repairable. It would certainly require a massive operation to rewire all the damaged tendons. He checked his trauma level. Still high. He hadn't felt this stressed since his souffle dropped back on the Nova 5. It was his first time in the kitchen, and it was for the Flight Admiral's birthday, too. Oh, the shame, the disgrace. It brought him out in overheat flushes even now. He gazed down at his leg again. Who would want a mechanoid who was physically imperfect? There was no option. He would offer to terminate himself. He checked his self-esteem level. It was absolute 0. Excellent. At least that was still normal. Yes, when it was convenient, he would wipe his hard drive and close down his program. It was the only solution. No, he was being absurd, idiotic and ridiculous. How could he possibly terminate himself? Who on earth would tidy up his body parts? Terminating himself would just make the place untidy. Logically, therefore, he had to continue living. He couldn't think about this now. He glanced at his watch. 3 minutes until the Oblivion virus was launched. Suddenly, the vehicle slowed as they approached the tight right-hand bend. That was all too familiar. The telegraph pole was also familiar. Crichton held his breath. They passed it safely. The buggy changed gear and started to gun up the highway. Stop! The Guelph captain held up its paw and peered at a line of footsteps coming over the brow of a dune. and hugging the roadway. He squinted at the tracks, then craned over his shoulder and peered back in the direction they had come.
Reverse!
The buggy reversed for 300 feet before the dollar chimp ordered it to stop on the arc of the bend, right alongside the telegraph pole that housed the modem leads. Crichton looked at his watch again. 2 minutes. Tension level close to blowout.
What is that?
The captain pointed at the black tape wrapped around the brown pole, which held the leads in place. Crichton watched the dollar chimp walk slowly up to the pole. It ripped off the tape, and the leads came free. Then it traced the leads to the bottom of the pole.
What is this?
It pulled at the lead, which came up out of the desert. The dollar chimp fed it back to the buried computer in its lead box.
What is this?
The dollar chimp ran across the telegraph pole and started to climb. Crichton's watch, 1 minute. It reached the top of the pole and stared at the connector clips feeding into the fibre optics of the main supply.
Feeding something into the electric supply?
30 seconds. The dollar chimp pulled out its hollow whip and clicked it on. The orange lash shimmered into life.